Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Israel's hand in sabotaging Iran's nuclear program is finally almost confirmed. In an interview to Israel's Channel 12, outgoing Mossad chief Yossi Cohen offered the closest acknowledgement yet his country was behind recent attacks targeting Iran's nuclear program and a military scientist. Cohen, considered very close to ousted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, also warned other scientists in Iran's nuclear program. And this is the quote from that interview as reported: "If the scientist is willing to change career and will not hurt us anymore, then yes, sometimes we offer them a way out." In July 2020, a mysterious explosion destroyed Natanz's advanced centrifuge assembly. Iran later blamed Israel. Then in April of this year, another blast tore apart one of the underground enrichment halls. Discussing Natanz, the interviewer asked Cohen where he would take them if they could travel there. And Cohen said, "To the cellar, where the centrifuges used to spin. It doesn't look like it used to look." According to several international media outlets that reported the story, Cohen did not directly claim the attacks, but his comments on specifics offered the closest official acknowledgement of an Israeli hand in the attacks. Considering that the contents of the interview could not have passed through the censors, it appears that the interview is a signal to Iran, just like the acknowledgement in 2018 of Mossad's operation to steal Iran's nuclear archives. In the latest interview, Cohen defended Netanyahu's decision then to make the results of the raid public by saying it was important to us that the world will see this. But this thing should also resonate with the Iranian leadership to tell them, dear friends, 1, you have been infiltrated. 2, we see you. 3, the era of lies is over. The bit about infiltration and we can see you is vital because none of the agents that raided and stole the archives was Israeli. In the intelligence world, it would be considered a stellar operation, perhaps not in the same league as Op Rubicon, but very impressive nonetheless. Cohen also spoke indirectly about the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, an Iranian military-affiliated scientist who was killed in November 2020. But let me get to the panel to discuss this further. I'm joined by Mustafa Khushcheshm in Tehran. Mustafa is a journalist and analyst who has taught at a number of Iranian universities and academic centers. Dr. Kamran Bukhari, Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, and George Szamuely, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute and author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. Right, so this is what I propose here. Before I get to Mustafa and George, Kamran, I want to get your very quick take, given your background in intelligence analysis, of what you think of Yossi Cohen's interview and what he said about having eyes in Iran and having infiltrated the system there.
Yossi Cohen said, confirmed my December 9th, 2020 Wall Street Journal op-ed that Israel has heavily penetrated the Iranian nuclear and military sector and at a tactical level. So what the former Mossad chief said basically confirms my analysis at the time. To answer your question, look, there's a context in which this is taking place. The United States, under the Biden administration, is about to return to the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, which was suspended by or at least nixed by the Trump administration. So that has the Israelis concerned. Definitely the Israeli concern is that the Iranians will be emboldened by the return to the deal. And this is psychological operations based on actual operations. So by releasing the tactical detail, essentially the Israelis are telling the Iranians, we have you penetrated. Until now, if you didn't believe that, or if there were any doubts, you should not be doubtful anymore. And it is done in a very careful way. You mentioned that it had to basically pass the test of what the Israeli government and how much of the Israeli government wants to reveal. But notice there was no compromise of operational details. In a very oblique way, the former Mossad chief said that we have the ability to actually do battle damage assessments. In other words, post-attack assessments of how much damage was done. And without, again, revealing sources, methods, or anything of that sort. So this is a serious psychological operations move, but it isn't psychological operations only. It is psychological operations backed by actual military and intelligence operations.
Right, actual ability. Okay, look, let me pull in Sayyid Mustafa Khushcheshm here. Now, Mustafa, we know that every time something like this has happened, Tehran has pointed a finger at Israel. However, the very idea that the Israeli intelligence has been able to infiltrate in a way where they have the capacity to conduct highly sensitive operations deep inside Iran should also be, I guess, a matter of grave concern for Iran.
Let me bring up some strategic importance of this situation right now. After the U.S. failed in its containment strategy to subdue Iran, to agree to talks over its missile program and regional power that relies very much on sanctions and posing credible military threat after events in the Persian Gulf, especially the Iranian missile strike on the U.S. airbase in Iraq's Ain al-Assad. Since 1.5 years or 2 years ago, the Israelis were called to run joint operations within this strategy of the United States to make U.S. threats against Iran credible. In this plan, they do, as my colleague said, they conduct some outstanding operations, security operations, not military ones, as a platform. Then they use propaganda and campaign and psychological operations for 4 purposes. The first goal and objective is pushing the Iranians towards a milder choice in the season, in the election season. We expected that since a long time ago, that the Israeli threats and actions would heighten in the election season in Iran to make Iranians or the Iranian voters, pick a milder choice towards the United States. Second, to change the calculations among officials in Tehran as Vienna talks are on the way. There are differences, and make them and convince them that they need to, agree with the U.S. terms in the Vienna talks. And the third is helping Netanyahu inside Israel, showing some kind of achievement for him in order to keep him in power, if possible. As regards all these 3 objectives, apparently the Israelis have failed. If they meant to push Iranians towards a milder choice in this election, apparently over 3/4 of Iranians believe, according to the latest polls conducted in the last 2 months especially, they would like to have Raisi, that they call a hardliner, actually a principlist, a revolutionary, in office to approach, to do a number of things, including approaching the U.S. with an iron fist. Second, if they meant to subdue Iran in the Vienna talks, Iran has not relinquished or given up any of its demands in the Vienna talks. Iran still insists that all sanctions should be removed and Iran should be given a verification period to verify if the sanctions have been removed in action or not. And the third, of course, it's very clear that Netanyahu was removed from his post. But let me not ignore this very important point, that whatever they've done when it comes to action, that's 30, 20, or 40% of the plan that the Israelis have been conducting. As I said earlier, it's a platform for later propaganda to undermine, the image of Iranian security might and power, especially for the domestic audience and the people. as regards those security operations, none of them has gone unanswered. Let's remember that a Mossad station in Erbil in Iraq came under attack and experienced a blast. Several Israeli Mossad officers were killed or injured in that attack. Then the Palestinians received a modern technology in that war that happened between Gaza and the occupied territories, the Israeli regime, and that helped the Palestinian power improve. Also, a missile landed 30 kilometers from the Dimona nuclear facility in Israel. That was a threat and warning to the Israelis that there are a lot of ways to undermine them and to hit them. Also, Israeli ships all around the world, especially in the Mediterranean as well as the Persian Gulf, came under attack. Also, two very highly important missile manufacturing plants near Tel Aviv went under fire, and there were blasts in these two facilities. One produces solid fuel for missile engines, and also the woods around Tel Aviv are on fire, and also there are many other moves. So this is kind of less than war, but these are security operations, tit for tat,
okay.
And
right.
None of them has gone unanswered. But
right.
It seems to me Yossi Cohen is just doing the propaganda part of this plan.
Okay. So this is something I'm going to take back to Kamran Bukhari, but George has been listening to this very patiently, so let me first get his view on Yossi Cohen's interview, and then we'll take it further. George.
I generally agree with my colleagues. Look, Israel is obviously very concerned about what the Biden administration is doing in Vienna. It really is worried that the Biden people do indeed intend to return to the JCPOA. So this is part of a warning shot and saying, okay, you go back to the JCPOA. This is what we are going to do. We are going to continue assassinating. We are going to continue causing explosions at Iran's nuclear facilities, and and it may well be, incidentally, that all these things happen with the active cooperation of the Trump administration and the intelligence agencies of the Trump administration. But what it is really also a warning of is that if Iran tries to do something about this, if Iran tries to retaliate, then I think Iran may be playing a very dangerous game, because American opinion is very, very unpredictable. And while America doesn't really like going to war against major powers, it much prefers picking on smaller powers. If there is a serious retaliation from Iran against Israel, it's very hard to know how America will respond. There could well be a kind of an explosion of public opinion.
Mustafa has just given us a brief list. Mustafa has just given us a brief list of the reprisal attacks, which is something that I'm going to take to Kamran. But yes, go on, George.
No, just to finish up that if that happens, if Iran does launch a serious retaliatory attack against Israel, and then Israel in due course also launches a very serious retaliation against Iran, then in a situation in which there is war between Iran and Israel, there's a very strong likelihood that the United States will be drawn in. American public opinion is very volatile on the subject of Israel, and I think that there's a real danger then that Iran could get itself in a serious military conflict with the United States. So there's a limit to how far Iran can escalate in response to these Israeli sabotage and terrorist acts.
Right. Thank you so much. That was George Szamuely speaking with us. Kamran Bukhari, you heard what Mustafa Khushcheshm said. These attacks have not gone without a response. Nonetheless, the issue of Israeli penetration is something that I'm assuming, Mustafa hasn't directly addressed that, but I'm assuming that it would be a cause for great concern to the Iranian security establishment.
Absolutely. I mean, look, if we were to compare what the Iranians do in response to Israeli actions inside Iran, then it's not much of a comparison. So everybody knows that Hamas and Hezbollah receive missiles and rockets from the Iranians, and from time to time, the Iranians get what we call in the business world a return on the investment. But I think that what's far more disturbing and cannot be sort of, if you will, strategically reciprocated is the fact that the Israelis have deep penetration inside Iran. What that does to I mean, Mustafa mentioned a number of things, but I think the most, the biggest sort of Israeli calculus is to undermine the faith in the regime, undermine the various elements within the regime that are disagreeing with each other in terms of how much risk Tehran should be taking. And so when you strike like that, you make the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which dominates the domestic security sector since at least 2009, in a big bind. It makes them look really bad. And naturally, any organization that suffers such kind of an attack under its watch is then forced to reassess its situation. In other words, the first order of business is to assess, to what extent are we penetrated, who are involved, track them down, eliminate them, neutralize those elements, and seal the leak, if you will. Now, what is happening is that Israel, in very short succession, is demonstrating that multiple parts of the Iranian nuclear and military sector is penetrated. So that creates a snowball effect, and Iranian security forces then have a huge task to figure out where all are they being hit from. And so that really, is undermining, it's detrimental to the security sector because you really don't know the fact that the Israelis are able to operate and then plot and execute unimpeded under the, essentially Iran is a police state. For them to be able to do that suggests a high level of tradecraft, number one, on the part of the Israelis. Number two, it sends a message, both internally in Iran and around the world, that for all the talk of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and the entire Iranian military security intelligence system, they're not that good. I mean, these things are happening under their watchful eyes. So that's pretty devastating for the regime. And obviously, they're not going to talk about it. They will not acknowledge it. On the contrary, they will say, they will try to play it down and then point to their ability to strike back. But what's more important is that it creates a rift within the system. There are those who are saying, look, let's not be distracted by the Israelis. There's a pressure to respond to the Israelis from certain elements within the system. But then there are other elements saying, let's keep the eye on the ball, which is the return to the nuclear deal, which is worth far more to the Iranians than anything else. And once they have reached a return to the agreement, they will be able to benefit from financially from that agreement and then address these things. So there's a huge debate going on, and these kind of attacks exacerbate those debates between those who say, let's keep an eye on the prize, and those who are saying, no, we can't look bad in front of the Israelis and we need to strike. In other words, there's an exacerbation of existing internal fault lines within the Iranian system through such attacks.
Okay. Those are the fault lines I would like Mustafa to address. But let me also welcome Pierluigi Paganini, who is joining us. Pierluigi is member of the European Union Agency for Network and Information Security, Threat Landscape Stakeholder Group, and Cyber G7 group. Pierluigi, thank you so much. Just bear with me. I want to get some, pointers from Mustafa before I get back to you. Mustafa, Kamran has raised some very important points, and I would like you to very quickly address them because I want to then go to Pierluigi in order to get his view on the cyber attacks that Iran has suffered. Mustafa.
First of all, let me correct my colleague. The in charge of security of Iran's nuclear facilities, as well as Iranian scientists, is not the IRGC or IRGC intelligence unit. It's the intelligence ministry that operates under the government of President Rouhani, and it's very much being blamed right now. That's why after these two attacks on Fakhrizadeh and Natanz, they shifted the responsibility for the security of facilities as well as scientists to the IRGC intelligence, especially with regard to Natanz, the facility. So it's not the IRGC. Second of all intelligence forces around the world are vulnerable. Every now and then they receive a strike. And if it's not been, the list that I gave you was not enough, let me add one more point. Mr. Fakhrizadeh, once he was, the leading scientist, but he, trained so many younger scientists 10, 15 years ago. And he was about to be retired in the next 2-3 years. And also his institute no more dealt with Iran's nuclear program, but it started other, high-tech activities, including it was the first to produce a sample for coronavirus test kits. On the other hand, if it's not been enough, let me compare it to something that happened a couple of weeks ago in Israel. The guy that was the top director of Israel's aerospace agencies or missile industries and was retired, he was killed in an accident just a couple of weeks ago. He was as important as Dr. Fakhrizadeh. I don't mean to say that it's been Iran. Maybe God has punished the Israelis, but this is a security war. That's a war of intelligence. As far as actions are concerned, I can, as an Iranian, I can be very much relaxed to say that whatever the Israelis have done, they've received a response. And they have failed in their objective to subdue Iran in Vienna talks, as this has been part of the Americans' plot in order to force Iran to give in to the U.S. terms in Vienna, and they have failed. Iran unveiled its IR-9. Iran has never, ever talked about its 9th generation of centrifuge machines that produce 50 SUs, separate working units. We have always been hearing about IR-8. But after the attack, they unveiled IR-9. Also, after the attack, Iran started enriching uranium to 60%. And if needed, they are warned to go to 90%. And they have failed, therefore. But when it comes to propaganda, that's exactly what the Israelis are doing, and that's their main target, to claim that Iran's security is not as powerful as Iran says. And they mean to undermine the image of Iran's security power
that's part of the Iranian public. That's the cyber warfare that Kamran was talking about. But I'm very happy, Mustafa. I'd love for you to do the Yossi Cohen on my program, frankly, in relation to Israel. But I think Kamran's point about the IRGC had less to do with which particular body is responsible for nuclear security and more to do with the fact that this is the umbrella organization that kind of, in terms of the overall security of Iran, is the predominant force. But stay with me, Mustafa. Let me get Pierluigi. Pierluigi, we're talking about the fact that the Israelis have been mounting, as we're talking about Yossi Cohen's interview, and we kind of, arrived at this conclusion that there is deep penetration within the Iranian system. Now, some of these have been physical assaults, but it started with cyber attack, Stuxnet, and then if you could also give us some idea of other cyber attacks in Iran that undermined the Iranian nuclear program. So yeah, Pierluigi, over to you.
Basically, we have to consider that the intelligence operations are composed by physical operation, but also from a cybersecurity point of view, there is a huge activity in terms of cyber espionage and also in terms of sabotage. You mentioned it correctly, the Stuxnet attacks. It was just an example of which can be the effect of a cyber weapon. And let's remind that a cyber weapon is just a code that was specifically designed to target a critical infrastructure or any other critical component within a critical infrastructure. And that's why we need to address such kind of activity with huge care. But anyway, I can tell you that we have to consider both the activity from classical intelligence, and we have also to go deep in what we can do today with cyber attacks and what we can do with cyber espionage. I can tell you that today probably most of the activity that governments conduct worldwide are located in the cyberspace. Why? Because you have to consider that using a cyber weapon, probably you can also escape the military sanctions worldwide. You have many difficulties in attribute a specific cyber attacks to a specific threat actor. This is a very huge problem. That make it very hard to attribute the attacks to a specific government or a specific, let me say, also cyber criminal organization. And probably another point that is advantaging the use of cyberspace or cyber attacks is that cyber attacks are very easy to arrange. In many cases, they can be arranged silently. But from an intelligence point of view,
Pierluigi, in the case of Stuxnet, if I remember correctly, there was the issue despite an air gap, and I think it was actually a thumb drive that was physically brought into the facility, which once again links up with the idea of penetration and sabotage or a lack of protocol or, what should I say, lax tradecraft. So that idea of actually sort of end running the air gap was actually the success of that operation. It wasn't like it was hacked from outside.
Clearly, an attack against an gap at the network is very difficult. Why? Because you need an insider, or you need to find a specific way to go inside the network, because the network, is totally separated from the internet. In Israel, there are specific groups that are working since at least 10 years in order to find a different way to target IGAP networks. We can target IGAP networks, for example, looking at a specific light that is the light of the hard disk inside the computer. And you can try to exfiltrate the information from that computer just simply looking at that light. Or, for example, recording the sounds that a hard disk making during the elaboration of information. So there are different ways that specific group of scientists, especially in Israel, are working on in order to exfiltrate data from IGAP networks. And in this case, we are speaking about exfiltrate information. But if you need to target with the sabotage attacks, you need an insider, like has happened in the case of Stuxnet. And in that case, someone went inside the nuclear plant, inserting the malicious code through an USB.
That's where the idea of penetration comes in. But Soma, that was Pierluigi Paganini speaking with us. Now, I'm almost out of time, but Kamran, Bukhari, quickly in 2 minutes, if you want to sum up, and then I'll go to Mustafa.
So, Ijaz, look, there is a technological gap. There is an issue of reach as well. And everybody, both sides, the Israelis and the Iranians, have their signature MO, the modus operandi, through which they operate beyond their borders. So in the case of the Israelis, it's by and large an intelligence operation run by Mossad, and they have cutouts, for example, in Iran, and we've seen their handiwork over the years. Conversely, if you look at the Iranians use proxy groups, groups that are in Iraq, groups that are in Syria, in Lebanon, and now even in Yemen. And that both are two different kinds of operations. I have not seen any evidence that the Iranians can operate inside Israel. Yes, theoretically, you could, have people of Arab or Palestinian background. The Israelis call them Israeli Arabs. They're referred to as Palestinians as well, that are inside Israel, and that the Iranians could potentially recruit and get to do what they want them to do. Again, they're up against a very formidable domestic security infrastructure. So there's that. So what they do is whenever there's a Gaza war, lately we've not seen any major strikes from Hezbollah. But these are the ways in which the Iranians try to operate.
That's a very important point with reference to ammo. Sorry, I'm cutting you short, but as I said, I'm running out of time. Mustafa Khushcheshm, very quickly in 2 minutes, if you want to sum up.
Yeah, I disagree with my colleague because just a couple of years ago, a former Israeli minister was caught by Mossad for spying for Iran. He used to be an economy minister or a health minister, and they arrested him and they declared it. I mean, the Israelis said it out loud. About Stuxnet, we don't have time. I would rather explain because I've done lots of research and studies on that. It was not an inside job. Actually, they contaminated a supplier, a local supplier, and then it was very, sophisticated technology that involved also Americans as well as Siemens of Germany and so on and so forth. It was not just Mossad. And when it comes to Israeli attacks, cyber attacks, they start lots of propaganda. But when Iran does something, they never talk about it. That's the problem, actually, because sometimes it's good to talk about it, and they forget that media matters, public opinion matters.
No, but that's where Iran has to talk about it, Mustafa. That's where Iran has to create a narrative like the Israelis do. And I said to you, I'd love for you to do a Yossi Cohen on this program. But thank you so much. And I suspect that we'll have the opportunity to talk more about Iran since you're moving towards the presidential elections. But thank you so much, Sayyid Mustafa Khushcheshm. Thank you also to Dr. Kamran Bukhari. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the situation in Afghanistan, where violence continues. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Afghanistan remains on razor's edge. U.S. NATO troop withdrawal continues apace. Violence is spiking every day. As per U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, U.S. has begun aerial combat and support patrols and operations from ships in the Gulf. Turkey has indicated it would be ready to keep some troops to provide local protection to Kabul airport. The Taliban have said Turkey should withdraw its troops from Afghanistan under the Doha Agreement. Turkey's offer is, however, contingent on more details, which Turkey's President Erdogan says need to be worked out at the NATO summit starting today. A district in war has fallen to the Taliban. Western Kabul has been hit by multiple blasts in a span of 2 weeks. The Afghan National Security Forces are increasingly under pressure and stretched. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Hamdullah Hamdard, an Afghan journalist in Kabul, and Dr. Adam Weinstein, former U.S. Marine and currently research fellow, Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. Let me begin with Adam Weinstein. Adam, this is like, actually, as we discussed last time, it's like packing your bags and getting out, but at the same time trying to figure out how you could work out a post-withdrawal security arrangement. And that seems to be what the New York Times called the search for bases. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere right now, but as I said, Secretary Austin has said that the U.S. is using the ships in the Gulf to mount patrols and combat support. So what do you think is the likely scenario on the ground in terms of, given that the Afghan indigenous capacity to provide close air support is almost nil?
Well, there was just a VOA story that was published today, in fact, that claimed that CENTCOM has announced they won't provide air support in support of the ANDSF, but they will provide remote advising. Of course, we've seen, at least in testimony in public hearings and in articles, a back and forth about whether the U.S. will provide support to the ANDSF. And there was an article last week, I believe in the New York Times, that suggested that if a major city, or at least if Kabul were about to fall, the U.S. would provide support. I think it's going to be a decision that the pros and cons are weighed in the moment. I don't think the United States is going to have a policy going forward that is unchangeable either way. In terms of how the ANDSF will provide without air support, that remains to be seen. I think it will come down to their resolve to fight. Of course, the Taliban themselves don't have air support and have been quite successful on the battlefield, although they also use tactics like IEDs that wouldn't be acceptable for the ANDSF. So I guess we'll see.
Right. Okay. So, well, actually, the Taliban are using commercially available drones now. Of course, they don't have the beyond the line of sight capability, but obviously for reconnaissance and the rest of it, getting real-time sort of picture of the terrain, they are important. Well, let me pull in Hamdullah Hamdard here. Hamdullah Hamdard, let's talk about the internal security situation. Now, as I said, forget about the rest of the country. Let's talk about Kabul. Western Kabul, as I said in my opening, within a span of 2 weeks has seen multiple blasts, and people have been killed. And Khalili has come on the record as asking for security. So tell our viewers what the situation is like, and the fact that there seems to be a rising sort of resentment among the Hazaras and others residing in Western Kabul, against the government for its inability to take care of them.
As we see the security situation, especially in the capital Kabul, we witnessed about 3 explosions in the last 2 to 3 or 4 days. 2 of them were in Deshti-Barchi area, where our Hazara homelanders are living, and one was in the 8 police district, where the other people live, or the other tribes live. Unfortunately, in such blasts or explosions, the educated youths are targeted and the civilians are targeted, not the military forces. The 2 attacks or the 2 explosions that happened in Deshti-Barchi area, that was, claimed by ISIS. ISIS has claimed that they have done that. Mostly the Hazara target killings are done by ISIS in Afghanistan. This simply means it is controlled by foreign hands. It's not controlled by Afghans. Someone outside of Afghanistan is trying to create the problem of Sunni and Shia in Afghanistan. So far, we do not have that problem in Afghanistan, alhamdulillah. And some countries or some intelligence agencies are trying to create this problem, such as, this problem exists in Iraq, in some other Islamic countries as well, and even in Iran. But in Afghanistan, so far we do not have such a problem, and the government and the people, or the ulama, the Islamic scholars, have controlled this Sunni Shia enmity, or the
right. I get your point. It's a good moment to sort of segue into something else. The Makkah conference of religious scholars, where there were scholars from Pakistan also, who talked about this entire thing being haram. What do you think is how effective could that be in terms of reducing violence in Afghanistan? A sort of, religious consensus that the violence should be brought to an end.
I believe that the agreement between the religious scholars from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia that can play the key role in reducing the violation in Afghanistan, as well as the fight or the war that is currently going on in Afghanistan. It will have a religious effect on this one. But unfortunately, we see that even after that, that Pakistani and Afghan ulama or Islamic scholars agree on calling the Afghan war haram or illegal according to Sharia. Still, we see the war has escalated. Taliban are fighting against the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And the security situation overall in Afghanistan, it is worsening day by day. The civilians are killed, and there are lots of casualties on both sides, to Taliban and to the government as well. It is very unfortunate that those who claim themselves as Muslims, they do not respect the decision that is made by Pakistani ulama and Afghans and the Saudi ulama in the Saudi Arabia. The situation is getting in its most unfortunate situation at the moment, unfortunately.
Absolutely. On that note, before I wrap up, let me go back to Weinstein. So Adam, give me a sense of, since you had a tour of Afghanistan, how would you sort of compare or contrast the situation now? I mean, at the time we also saw the Obama surge. Now, of course, the troops that are withdrawing, I mean, there were already 2,500 troops, and mostly, training duties or some close air support in certain cases. So the Afghan National Security Forces, as I said in my opening, are already stretched, and there are also reports of some desertions, and there are reports of, demoralized troops. There have been reports of, officers pocketing money, and presenting a roster which was actually fake, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple problems here. So that said, what is your prognosis in terms of their ability to resist the Taliban? I mean, we saw the Iraqi army, like 14 divisions of Iraqi army, fold in front of the ISIS onslaught.
Well, the case of Mosul and ISIS should be a premonition for the ANDSF and for the United States, for that matter. But there's no reason from a resources standpoint that the ANDSF should not be able to stand up to the Taliban. I mean, they've received more training, they have more equipment, they have more funding, and they're larger in number, although I think that number is sometimes exaggerated. We do see the reports of ANDSF not being paid. Some of these issues have been endemic and for years, and sometimes higher-ranking members of the ANDSF will claim they don't exist, and I think that's disingenuous. And sometimes folks in the Afghan government will claim they don't exist, and I also think that's disingenuous. But I also disagree with some analysis coming out of the United States that says the ANDSF will simply collapse. It's really going to come down to cohesion, leadership, and resolve to fight. If they have resolve to fight, then I don't see why they shouldn't be able to face the Taliban. Of course, that's not a sustainable solution either. That would just create a prolonged civil war, essentially. So what's necessary is to come to a political settlement. But it may be the case that a strong ANDSF that's able to resist the Taliban helps a political settlement come about. But there's a lot of gaps in security. I mean, the other guests talked about the fact that you don't see the same sectarian violence in Afghanistan. Well, there might be some truth to that, although I think the Hazara have historically faced at least ethnic discrimination in Afghanistan, if not religious discrimination. But if you look at the Dashti Barchi neighborhood, this is a neighborhood that's been targeted since, very heavily since 2016, when you see ISIS begin to rise in South Asia. And we could talk about, perhaps it's fair that some of this is being directed from abroad, but why is the ANDSF and the NDS not providing adequate security in this most vulnerable part of Western Kabul? I mean, from the reports I hear, there's close to no security. So why create these soft targets? So I think for the ANDSF to succeed, they're going to have to, have better leadership, and that might not. I'm not suggesting that leaders be replaced, but what I am suggesting is that there needs to be cohesion. There needs to be a clear strategy, and I think it should be a wake-up call for the ANDSF that CENTCOM just said they're not going to provide close air support. I think there's some folks in Afghanistan who think the United States will come to save the day, and I'm just not sure that's true. I think they are going to continue to receive support financially and technically, but they are in this fight alone now, and it's going to be up to the leadership of the ANDSF whether they are able to inspire the rank and file to keep fighting.
Absolutely, very interesting questions, very pertinent ones, and I agree with you, Adam, and with reference to security, Western Kabul, and interestingly, or shall I say, ironically, Kabul security is the direct remit of First Vice President Hamdullah, who was also the chief of NDS. But thank you so much. That was Adam Weinstein. Thank you also to Hamdard for his views. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.